The night shift never felt shorter or longer than necessary. It just stretched on in its own strange rhythm, somewhere between exhaustion and detachment. In the fluorescent-lit hallways of St. Jude Medical Center's ICU ward, Clara Nguyen moved like a whisper. She was the kind of nurse who didn't announce her presence, didn't need attention. And that night, like the 100+ nights before, she walked into room 407 at exactly 11:48 p.m. Jack Hartley lay as he always did, still, pale, untouched by the world's noise. Machines monitored his vitals with indifference, and the silence in his room was not oppressive but patient. There was no trace of who he had been before the accident. No visitors, no flowers, no photographs. Only the chart at the foot of his bed, listing him as male, mid-30s, trauma-induced coma, unidentified for weeks after admission. But to Clara, he was no longer anonymous. He was a presence, not an empty bed. She carried with her the same chipped Bluetooth speaker and a soft-bound journal. Her pale blue scrubs bore creases from a shift that had started 15 hours ago. Her black hair, usually tied in a neat bun, now hung in loose strands that fell along her cheekbones. She looked tired, but not defeated. Clara always saved Jack for last. It wasn't regulation, but it had become sacred to her, a private ritual that neither doctors nor policy could touch. When she closed the door behind her, something shifted. The weight she carried through the rest of the hospital loosened, and in this tiny room, her voice was still hers. She placed the speaker on the small table by his side and sat in the worn, leather chair that she had unofficially claimed. It groaned under her weight, like it remembered her. Clara folded her hands in her lap and watched his face. He was older than her by a decade, maybe more. A light scattering of gray touched his hair. His features were symmetrical, handsome, but softened by stillness. "Evening, Jack," she whispered. "Long day. You missed nothing." She smiled faintly. He never answered, of course, but she spoke to him anyway. It helped her stay anchored, grounded, human. That day had been particularly brutal. The nurses' station buzzed with rumors. More layoffs, budget cuts, mergers with a private chain. Clara didn't need gossip to read the writing on the wall. Her supervisor had called her in at lunch with a paper smile and careful language. "You've done great work, Clara, really. But the night program's being reevaluated, last in, first out." Her contract wouldn't be renewed. She had smiled, nodded, pretended to be fine. But now, here in this room where she didn't have to perform, Clara let her breath catch in her throat. She pulled the folded paper from her pocket, a letter she'd written during her dinner break. She looked at it but didn't read it again. She'd written what mattered. Instead, she looked at Jack and said, "I'm sorry. This will be the last time." She reached for his hand. She never asked permission, she just held it. The familiarity of his skin beneath hers, cool but constant, steadied her. "I always imagined you waking up," she murmured. "Not with fireworks or drama. Just maybe you'd blink once, maybe you'd move your hand, maybe you'd say, 'You sing off key,' and I'd laugh and never stop." Her throat tightened. "But they're letting me go, Jack. And tonight's the end of the song." She pressed play. A piano began, a sparse, aching arrangement of Coldplay's "Fix You." Clara's voice followed, soft at first, then fuller, warmer. The kind of voice that didn't need to be perfect to be unforgettable. Each note trembled with a story she never got to tell, and every breath she took carried a memory she hadn't been able to share with anyone else. She closed her eyes and sang into the dark. The machines hummed behind her. The monitor pulsed steadily. But something shifted barely. A spike in Jack's heart rate, minute but clear. And then, a tear, just one, slipped from the corner of his eye, trailing down across the bridge of his nose and disappearing into the white pillowcase. Clara didn't see it. She was already winding down. When the song ended, she exhaled slowly and whispered, "Sleep well, Jack." She kissed the back of his hand. She stood. Then she placed the folded letter gently beneath his pillow. It wasn't for the hospital. It wasn't for the files. It was for him. Then she turned off the speaker, turned off the lights, and walked out of room 407 for what she believed would be the last time. Outside, the hallway was sterile again. The world resumed. Monitors beeped from other rooms. A janitor wheeled past with his cart. Clara moved quietly down the corridor, one step at a time, each one heavier than the last. She didn't cry. Not yet. But behind her, Jack Hartley's fingers twitched. Just once. Enough to mean something, enough to begin. The city didn't sleep, but Clara's world had learned how to grow quiet. She sat curled in the single worn chair in her apartment, the one by the crooked window that looked out over I. Mission Street. The glow of the bakery's sign below flickered occasionally, casting pink and yellow shadows across her walls. It was past midnight, but Clara didn't move. Her scrubs still clung to her frame, heavy with the scent of antiseptic and fatigue. The thermos she held had long gone cold. She had sung to Jack for the last time. The thought circled her like a restless tide, pulling at memory and marrow. Every night, for nearly 4 months, that room had been her sanctuary, and now it was gone. Taken with the kind of detachment only bureaucracy could wield. She wasn't angry. Anger took energy. What she felt instead was a kind of quiet grief, like standing in a burned-down room and smelling the ashes of what once felt like home. It wasn't supposed to mean that much. He wasn't supposed to mean that much. Jack Hartley. A name scribbled into her routine, a body that didn't move, a chart that rarely changed. But he had become more than vitals and silence. He had become the one place in her life where she didn't have to pretend. She leaned her head against the window pane and closed her eyes. Her voice was hoarse now, tired from nights of whispering songs into the dark. But the songs had mattered. They were the only pieces of her past she dared to keep. Before nursing, before late shifts and hospital halls, there had been music. Her world had been melody, cadence, discipline wrapped in rhythm. Her father was the first to hear her sing. A schoolteacher with calloused fingers and a heart that beat in tempo. He taught music not because it paid well, it didn't, but because it kept him alive. They used to sing together, long before cancer turned his voice into coughing fits and sleepless nights. Clara was 13 when he handed her a second-hand microphone and said, "Don't be afraid of your sound. Let it be bigger than your fear." She never forgot that. But when he got sick, music became a luxury. Her scholarships dried up. Her part-time performances at the jazz lounge became rare. The final audition she never attended still sat like a missed heartbeat in the back of her memory. She traded stardust for shift rotations. Her father needed her. That was the only song she listened to then. After he passed, silence became a language of its own. She thought maybe nursing would help her hold on to something, anything real. But hospitals had their own tempo, one too fast and too sterile for dreaming. She adapted. Clara learned to move quietly, to care without asking questions, to keep her softness hidden behind efficiency. It was safer that way. Until Jack. He was broken when he arrived. Broken in that deep, unspoken way some people are, where even their stillness holds weight. The ER didn't know his name for the first 10 days. No wallet, no contacts, just the bruised shell of a man whose eyes refused to open. When they finally found his name through a fragment of an insurance policy, there was still no one to call. No one came. Clara hadn't been scheduled that night, but she volunteered to cover. Something about him unsettled her. Not fear, something else. Curiosity. She remembered the way his brow had creased ever so slightly, even unconscious. Like someone in the middle of an unfinished thought. She started talking to him out of habit, the way nurses do with long-term patients. But then she kept going. She began to bring her old speaker. The first song she played was by accident. A tune from her playlist that just happened to shuffle in. She watched for a flicker, a reaction. There was none, but she came back anyway. It wasn't just the music that anchored her to Jack. It was the stillness that let her be. When she sat beside him, the world quieted. No one interrupted. No one asked for anything. She could sing without apology, could hum the verses she'd long forgotten, could talk about her mother's stubborn kindness or the shoes that blistered her toes or the sadness that came like rain and refused to leave. Jack became her listener, even if he didn't know it, even if she didn't believe he ever would. One night, she whispered a secret into the hush, her voice barely audible above the monitors. "I don't remember who I am when I'm not tired." She didn't expect anything in return, but she had imagined him hearing her, not with ears, with something deeper. Now, back in her apartment, Clara wondered if any of it had reached him, if even one note had sunk beneath the surface of his silence. She stood, finally, and walked to the shelf where she kept the framed photo of her father. Next to it was a small vase, empty. She used to fill it with wildflowers every week, but flowers had become indulgences, too fleeting, too expensive. She picked up the vase anyway, and in her mind she placed a daisy inside. "Good night, Jack," she whispered to no one, and for the first time since her contract ended, she sang. Not for him, not for her patience, not for the past. She sang for herself. And somewhere, far, across the city, in a sterile room where the scent of lavender still lingered faintly, a heartbeat quickened. Something was stirring. The silence wasn't the end. It was only waiting for a second verse. Jack Hartley had once been the kind of man whose presence bent a room, softly but unmistakably. He didn't need to speak loudly or wear designer suits. People leaned in when he spoke, not out of obligation, but from gravity. He built things, companies, solutions, legacies, out of intuition and silence. He was a self-made tech visionary, but never a showman. That wasn't his rhythm. He had been a pianist first. The story of Jack's rise to fame usually began in boardrooms and ended in IPOs. But that wasn't the truth. Not really. The truth was quieter, messier, hidden behind closed doors and late nights at the piano bench in his childhood home. His mother, a school music teacher in Queens, taught him how to read music before he could write his own name. The house always smelled like strong coffee and old books, and in the background, always, there was jazz. He learned to listen before he learned to speak. By his 20s, Jack had left the music behind to follow the pull of technology. He didn't abandon it entirely. He just placed it in the back pocket of his soul, folded and creased like an old song he thought he'd return to later. Business consumed him. He co-founded a platform that transformed the way people traded intellectual property, dry, lucrative, and ethically gray. But he never truly fell in love with any of it, until Camille. She wasn't like the world he had built around himself. She was color in a grayscale system, a woman whose laugh didn't apologize and whose apartment floor was always covered in paint. They met at a gallery in Soho, both admiring the same abstract piece with too much red and not enough form. She told him it looked like the sound of heartbreak. He said it reminded him of Coltrane's Naima. That was the start. Camille had been a music therapist. She worked with children who didn't speak, didn't trust, didn't open, until she sat beside them with a ukulele or her old clarinet. Jack once told her she did more good in an hour than he did in a quarter. She kissed his forehead and told him he was allowed to do both. He started playing again. Not in public. Never for anyone but her. Sunday mornings became their ritual. He'd wake early, make coffee, and play until the sunlight warmed her toes where she lay curled on the couch, sketching. They had a life stitched with softness. Then the forgetting began. It started small. She called his toothbrush the thing with bristles and left the stove on overnight. The MRI confirmed what they were too afraid to say aloud: glioblastoma. Fast, aggressive, terminal. Camille, who had soothed so many minds with music, began to slip away from her own. Jack stepped back from everything, from work, from music, from the world. He spent every minute trying to buy her time. But love couldn't fight biology, and money couldn't outpace death. She died on a Tuesday. Jack remembered because the sky had been too blue. After her funeral, he disappeared. No press release, no staged exit. He gave up his title, handed off control, and vanished into the corners of the country where no one knew his name. He became a ghost with a pulse. No more music, no more ambition, just silence. And then, one night, broken and aimless, he visited the cemetery where Camille was buried. He brought lilies. The wind took them before he reached her stone. He stood, anyway, soaked in rain and grief. He whispered her name, once, then turned to leave. That's when the car struck him. He never saw it. The next thing he remembered, if it could be called remembering, was a buzzing light, a thrum of machines, and a voice. It wasn't Camille's, it was softer, less certain. Human, a woman's voice cracked from fatigue, singing. He couldn't open his eyes, couldn't speak. But the voice wove itself into the silence that had claimed him. Not music as performance, but as connection. She talked to him, sang to him, cried beside him, told him stories about her aching feet and the rude patient in room 324, and how she missed her father every time she saw a trumpet. She didn't know he was listening, but Jack heard everything. At first, it came to him like a dream, the curve of her vowels, the rhythm of her breath between lines. But then he began to anticipate it, when she would sit, when her voice would crack, when she'd laugh nervously and say, "This is ridiculous, you can't hear me." But he could, and that made all the difference. Her name was Clara. He learned that by accident the night she dropped her badge on the floor and whispered, "Clara, get it together." It echoed in him like a melody. She was his lighthouse in the fog, the tether he didn't know he needed. And the night she said goodbye, the night she cried while singing "Fix You" and something inside him splintered. Not from pain, from awakening. He remembered Camille's smile, yes, but it was Clara's voice that brought the color back into the memory. He tried to move. His body didn't answer. He tried to speak. No sound came, but her kiss on his hand felt like the first time someone had touched him without expectation since the accident. Since before. He wasn't ready to wake up yet, but he was closer. He could feel the shape of the world again, and it no longer terrified him. Jack Hartley, the man behind the machines, had started to return, not because of medical miracles, but because a nurse with a tired voice and a borrowed speaker reminded him that silence doesn't mean absence. Means waiting, and he was done waiting. When Jack Hartley finally opened his eyes, it wasn't to a grand revelation or a cinematic swell of music. It was to the ordinary rhythm of machines and morning light slanting across a sterile white wall. The sound of a monitor beeped steadily beside him, like a heartbeat with a metronome. He blinked slowly, once, twice, then let the world settle into focus. The nurse standing at the foot of his bed gasped audibly and called for the attending. Footsteps followed, voices swelled, questions arrived in waves. "Do you know where you are? Can you move your fingers? What's your name?" He answered as best he could, but his mind was somewhere else, chasing a voice that had carried him through the darkness. Clara. The name lived in him like breath now. The nurse who had sung when no one else came, who whispered grief and lullabies in equal measure, who cried when she thought no one was listening. She had saved him. Not with medicine, not with touch, but with something far more fragile and infinitely powerful. Presence. Is she still here? He asked, his voice a ragged whisper. "Who?" The night nurse replied, gently adjusting the IV line. "The nurse who used to sing to me. Clara." The woman paused. Then her expression softened with the kind of empathy born from knowing the answer someone doesn't want to hear. She was let go. Budget cuts. About a week ago, I think it broke her heart to leave you. Jack's fingers gripped the edge of the blanket. He stared up at the ceiling, his voice too quiet to argue. "Do you know where she went?" The nurse shook her head. "I'm sorry, she used to hum that Joni Mitchell song all the time, though. You know the one, A Case of You. Beautiful voice, the kind that stays with you." And it had stayed. With him. Every note, every pause, every imperfection that made it more real. The next day, Jack demanded discharge paperwork. The doctors objected, of course. He was still weak, recovering from significant trauma and prone to dizziness. But Jack had made up his mind. What good was recovery without a reason? His body bore the damage of months spent still, but his mind, his heart, were moving with an urgency he hadn't felt in years. Clara had sung him back to life, and now he needed to find her. He began with what he remembered. Her full name, Clara Nguyen. He searched public nursing records, browsed forums, followed loose threads that led nowhere. He didn't know her birthday, her address, or if she was even still in the city. What he had was less than a breadcrumb trail, but Jack had once built entire companies on less. Then he remembered something, a half-mumbled story she had once told during a long night. Back when I still thought I'd make it as a singer, I uploaded some old covers, still out there somewhere, buried under dust. Jack searched every possible username. He tried variations on her name, year of birth, music terms. Finally, a profile surfaced. Clara Voice 1989. 3 tracks, 2 covers and 1 raw. A cappella original that cracked in the middle and picked up again like nothing happened. The 3rd song was A Case of You. His heart thudded in recognition. He played it, and for the first time since Camille died, Jack Hartley cried freely. He didn't wipe the tears. He let them fall, silent and salt-heavy as her voice filled the room. He was no longer lying in a bed unable to speak. He was a man awake, alive, and aching. That night he didn't sleep. He sent the link to a contact at a boutique label in Berkeley. Not with fanfare, just with a subject line. This voice saved me. It deserves to be heard. Then he went digging further. The profile had once linked to an old scholarship application. From that, he found an address in the Mission District. The building was modest, aged with a cracked front step and a doorbell that buzzed too loudly. He knocked. No answer. A woman from next door peeked her head out. Jack introduced himself cautiously, unsure of what truth to tell. "She's not here anymore," the woman said, brushing a dish towel against her palms. "Moved out 2 weeks ago, quiet girl, always humming, left without saying much." Jack nodded slowly. "Do you know where she went?" "Afraid not. But she talked about music again right before she left. Said something about finally breathing." Jack stood on the step a moment longer after the woman returned to her apartment. The wind was cooler here. The smell of bread wafted from the bakery across the street. He remembered Clara's stories of coming home late and climbing tired stairs. To the scent of sugar, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the scarf. It was light gray, knit by hand, faintly infused with lavender. Clara used to drape it over him during cold hospital nights, murmuring, "There, that's better." He folded it carefully, placed it on her old doorstep, and tucked a note underneath. "Thank you for your voice, for your presence, for everything. You didn't know you gave me. I'm alive because of you." He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. Somehow, he knew she'd understand. Back in his temporary apartment, Jack sat at a rented upright piano. It was out of tune in one key, and the bench creaked if you leaned too far left. But it was enough. His fingers hovered above the keys, trembling. Not from fear, but from recognition. He hadn't played in years, not since Camille. But tonight, he didn't play for grief. He played for Clara. He built her voice into notes, remembered every inflection, translated every vibration. The piece wasn't grand, but it was honest. And when it was finished, he titled it simply, Her Song. Then he waited. Because if he had learned anything from the woman who sang him back into the world, it was that sometimes the quietest voices were the ones that never left you. Clara never thought she'd sing on a stage again. Not under lights, not with an audience, not in a room that listened for her rather than through her. But life, it seemed, had ways of bending when you least expected it. She stood backstage in a community theater just off Polk Street, her hands trembling around a vintage microphone. The room wasn't large, barely 100 seats, but each one was filled. Strangers, some former patients' families, local artists, and a few hospital nurses from her old shifts at St. Jude's. Clara didn't know how the word had spread, but it had. The invitation had come anonymously via email with a simple subject line. "We heard your voice. We'd like to hear more." Attached was a time, a date, and a warm message from Indigo Sound, a boutique label that specialized in undiscovered, unpolished brilliance. She had almost deleted it. Then something inside her, something she hadn't trusted in a long time, said, Don Margot, the event organizer, peeked around the curtain. "You ready, Clara?" Clara inhaled, then nodded, even though her knees felt like paper. When the lights dimmed and her name was spoken aloud into the mic, she stepped forward, slowly, like someone entering sacred ground. The spotlight was softer than she expected, gentle, inviting. She didn't speak, didn't introduce herself. She simply nodded to the pianist, someone Indigo had provided, and waited for the chords to begin. It was A Case of You, her father's favorite. The song she'd sung to herself on the subway platform, the one she used to whisper into the folds of a hospital pillow. Her voice was quiet at first, almost too fragile to carry. But with each note she reclaimed something: control, purpose, breath. She closed her eyes on the second verse, not out of nerves, but because memory was flooding in. Her father teaching her how to hold a phrase. The scent of lavender from her old scarf. The weight of Jack's hand in hers. She had no idea he was sitting in the third row. Jack didn't blink. From the moment she stepped into the light, he forgot every reason he'd given himself to stay hidden. He had debated whether to come, worried he would only add confusion, pressure, exposure. But when he saw her, shoulders squared, voice trembling into strength, he knew this wasn't about him. It never had been. This was about her finding herself. Again. And yet, when she opened her eyes mid-song and saw him, seated just off-center, something shifted. Their eyes locked, and the note she was holding faltered for a split second, just enough to remind everyone she was human. She looked away, finished the song with grace, and stepped off stage into the shadows as the applause rose. She didn't go back to the green room. She didn't look for validation. She went looking for him. He was waiting at the end of the hallway, by a table cluttered with donation brochures and a half-eaten fruit tray. He held something in his hands, wood, simple, square, a frame. She knew before he even showed it. The note, her handwriting. "I hope even just a little you felt loved." Clara's throat tightened. "You kept it," she whispered. Jack nodded. "I framed it." She swallowed. Her hands were still shaking. "How long have you been awake?" "Long enough to miss you. Not long enough to forget." Clara stared at him for what felt like a full minute before stepping forward, one cautious step at a time. "I thought I imagined the tear," she said. "That night, the one that slipped down your cheek." "You didn't." His voice cracked slightly. "That was real. They didn't hug. Not yet. There was too much between them that needed no touch, no words. Just being there was enough. Come with me," Jack said suddenly. "Where? Somewhere quiet, somewhere I can tell you what your voice did to me." She followed. Outside, the night air was cool and tasted like sea salt and possibility. They walked to a bench facing the bay. Lights blinked on the water. Jack sat first. Clara joined him, her hands curled around her elbows for warmth. "I was in pieces," he said, "long before the accident. After Camille. After I lost her, I stopped living. The coma didn't take me. I left long before that. I remember." "The name," Clara said softly. "Camille, you murmured it once." Jack looked at her, startled. "You heard that?" "I heard all of it, even your silence." He let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. "You didn't just sing to me, you rewrote me. One note at a time." Clara closed her eyes. "And now?" "Now," Jack said, "I'm writing for you." He pulled something from his pocket, another envelope. Inside, sheet music titled, "Her Song." She traced the title with her fingertips. "You remembered it all?" "Every note." Then he added, "If you'll let me, I want to keep remembering." That was when Clara leaned in. Not for drama, not for closure, but for something real, something soft. She rested her head on his shoulder and said, "I don't know what this is yet." Jack nodded. "We don't need to name it." "But I do know," she whispered. "You heard me when no one else did. And that matters. Jack didn't reply. He just reached for her hand and held it like he was still catching a melody. And in the silence that followed, there was no distance between them. Only music. Clara's apartment above the bookstore felt like something imagined into existence. Sunlight streamed through the window panes each morning, filtered by gauzy curtains that fluttered with the breeze. Below, the quiet thrum of passing. Footsteps mixed with the rustling of pages from patrons browsing the second-hand shelves. It was peaceful here, uncomplicated, the kind of peace that doesn't ask for attention, but insists on being noticed. Clara had found rhythm again. Not the mechanical kind dictated by shift rotations and beeping monitors, but the kind that hummed beneath her ribs and guided her breath. Music was no longer a memory of who she had been. It was a conversation with who she was becoming. Her voice no longer trembled with hesitation. It carried history and hope in equal measure. Jack visited often. He brought takeout and forgotten poetry books, sheet music stained with coffee rings and notes scribbled in the margins. He never stayed too long or arrived unannounced. He understood space, but every time he left, he took a little of her silence with him. The day her first EP was released, they didn't celebrate with champagne or a launch party. Instead, they listened to it together on her old speaker, the same one she had carried into room 407 all those nights ago. The album was raw, sparse, each track a letter. One was called 99 Steps, named after the number of steps from her apartment to the hospital bus stop. Another was simply Gray Scarf. The final track was a live recording from her performance of A Case of You. She had insisted on leaving in the minor crack her voice made during the second chorus. "It's honest," she told Jack. "People need to hear the break, not just the note." He smiled. "So do I." That fall, Jack moved into the apartment next door. They didn't label it. There was no declaration, just a slow merging of mornings, of grocery lists with both their handwriting, of notes slipped under each other's. Doors with lines like, "Heard birdsong in E major today," or "Don't forget the raspberries." Jack began teaching piano again, quietly, to children on the spectrum whose parents often cried after the first session, not from sorrow, but from witnessing their child's hands touch sound for the first time with intention. Clara helped, sometimes just by being present, sometimes by singing the same note repeatedly, until a child's fingers found the courage to follow. They were building something together, not a legacy, not a company, not a brand, just a place where healing didn't require explanation. The music label, impressed by Clara's authenticity, offered her a chance to headline a showcase. She hesitated. The idea of stages still unsettled her, but Jack encouraged her gently, never pushing, only reminding her of the letter she once left beneath a pillow. "I hope even just a little you felt loved." That voice, he said, was always meant for more than one room. The night of the concert, the venue buzzed with anticipation. It was held in an old theater nestled between two cafes, the marquee faded but charming. Inside, rows of velvet seats curved toward a modest stage framed by ivory curtains. Clara wore a simple slate blue dress and her mother's locket. Her hair was pinned loosely, strands tucked behind her ear. She stood in the wings, watching as the lights dimmed. Jack took his place behind the piano. No one announced him. He didn't need introduction. His hand spoke louder than any biography ever could. The first song began. "Fix You." The hush in the theater was total, sacred. Clara's voice came in soft but steady. The audience leaned forward as though afraid to miss even one breath. Every lyric she sang seemed to hang between them like a question and an answer. By the final verse, her voice thickened with emotion, but she didn't falter. Jack's accompaniment rose like a tide beneath her, supporting, not overwhelming. The final note lingered, weightless, before dissolving into silence. The room erupted, not just with applause, but with something deeper. Recognition. People weren't clapping for performance. They were clapping for presence, for truth. Clara turned to leave the stage. Jack stood, walked around the grand piano, and met her at center stage. Then he knelt. The audience stilled. from his coat pocket. He drew a velvet box and opened it. Inside was a ring, not new, not grand. A slender band of brushed gold with a small oval stone, lavender amethyst, the same hue as her scarf, the one she had wrapped around him when he was more ghost than man. Jack didn't speak with theatrics. He didn't need to. I once believed, I was beyond saving, he said, until I heard you sing. He took a breath. Clara Nguyen, will you keep singing with me for the rest of our days? Clara's eyes filled, not with shock, not even with surprise, but with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. She had sung for patients who didn't wake, for grief that never softened, for a future she thought was lost, and now here it was. In his eyes, she nodded. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes. The crowd stood. The ovation was thunderous, but Jack and Clara didn't hear it. They heard only each other. They held hands, stepped off stage, into the life they were choosing, one note at a time. Later that night, after the lights dimmed and the theater emptied, they walked home through streets lined with amber lamplight. Clara's shoes clicked against the pavement. Jack's cane tapped. Beside her in time. You still think music can't save people? She teased. He looked at her, eyes soft. No, he said. Now I think it's what brings us home. And as they disappeared around the corner, the city for just a moment listened. Just 2 weeks before the wedding, Clara received an envelope with no return address. Inside it was a single page, a scanned copy of a lawsuit filed 5 years ago. Plaintiff, Jack Hartley. Defendant, Redwood Children's Music Foundation. Grounds, alleged embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty. Clara's breath caught. That was the same nonprofit her father once tried to partner with for inner-city school music funding. The same one that mysteriously dissolved after donors pulled out. She remembered the late nights her father spent trying to save that grant before his final semester of teaching. She handed the paper to Jack without a word. He read it, his face unmoving, but his silence spoke volumes. Tell me this wasn't you, Clara whispered. It was, Jack said quietly, but it's not what you think. And suddenly, everything they'd built stood at the edge of collapse. Not because betrayal, but because of buried truths. What followed wasn't a fight. It was a reckoning. Jack opened up about the years he'd spent believing power meant control, even at the cost of ideals. About the man he was before the accident, and the one he feared still lived in his shadow. Clara had to choose, hold on to the pain of what was, or believe in what he'd become. And that night, as rain whispered against their windows, she reached for his hand, not because she had forgotten, but because she had forgiven. If stories like this move you, challenge you, and make you feel more deeply, don't forget to subscribe to Fortune's Wrath. Your support helps bring more unforgettable narratives like this to life.